So, first of all, I want to thank you so much, for taking the time being here today. I know it's not easy, you're traveling and everything. So, thank you so much for being here today, bro. And
No worries at all. It's cool to see some familiar faces. I think I know GM Hacker and Coffee and Me
yeah, the
for
Shad
sure.
is here today. A fucking Shad. Also, we have Delirious, we have Lucas, a lot of Chads, White, a lot of really nice people excited to see you, and I'm pretty sure that we're gonna grow a lot in audience until the end. So, bro, usually the way we start here is, you know, we want to know a little bit about more about the handles. We always see you on Twitter, but we don't know a lot about your life, what you've been doing in the past. So, can you introduce us to your background story a little bit, like what you did in the past and things that were important for you, and how did you came into first development, and then after we're gonna talk about Web3.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started coding when I was like 9 or 10, so a pretty long time ago. Kind of just working on like video game mods. I did a lot of stuff with like Minecraft, Gary's Mod, Source Engine, and it really kind of just captivated me, and I kept going with it. And I did front end development for a couple of years throughout my teens, and then I got into more back end development with writing in C, um, primarily to work on game engines and things like that. By the time that I hit college, I was really interested in kind of more low level systems development. And one of my professors actually got me into writing a lot of x86. And so I was working on things like just writing a lot of C and Java and systems dashboards and monitoring. And then one of my good friends actually introduced me into crypto, and I kind of started out working at a small DAO, doing kind of like analytics dashboards for them and front end things. But I always knew that wasn't really where I wanted to stay. So I started working on smart contracts work, and then kind of like the big thing that got me like really into crypto and knowing that I wanted to do it after I graduated college, which I did last December, was working on the Huff compiler. And so one day I kind of just randomly tweeted out because I was learning Huff back before kind of like the new Huff renaissance. And I really wanted to rewrite it in Rust because I was learning Rust for a couple months before that, doing some MEV things. Um, and then basically Jet from Rari Capital, and then he went to Pentagon, and now he's kind of taking a break to go back to school. He let me know that Andreas, who also works at Optimism now, had just started rewriting the Huff compiler in Rust. And so I think that was kind of like the first project that really brought me into the crypto scene and really kind of diving deeper into the EVM, etc. And then since then, I've worked on a lot of projects, a lot of which were around Huff. We wrote the Snark verifier, we wrote HuffMate. I've done a lot of work at Optimism in the past 6 or 7 months, and that kind of brings us to today. I work on smart contracts at Optimism and generally break a lot of things over there.
That's an amazing story, bro. But and it's also really fast. Can I ask how old are you? And if you don't feel comfortable saying, just maybe in the 20s, in the 30s.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm 23.
So it's pretty fast. I mean, you got from starting to develop to going to Minecraft and 8 x86. I mean, can you tell us before that, like, were you doing some sort of development, like fiddle into configuration files, trying to hack some game, or you just got into this and just got a hold of it?
Yeah, I would say that I kind of just got into it and got a hold of it. A lot of my
Wow.
computer science education was self-taught. I kind of just wanted to do things and figured out how along the way. Um, I didn't really get a formal education in computer science until I was in college. And by that point, I already kind of had my own ways for doing things, etc. I do think that college was useful in some certain aspects, but a lot of like my early computer science journeys and software development was me just kind of like crawling around online forums, figuring out how things worked, and just experimenting and breaking things and then eventually making them work.
And when did you notice that you had a talent for it? Because you obviously have, and like at some point you must say like, okay, I think I know this thing, and it's not easy for me, it took quite some time. For me, I started with development, and it wasn't easy for me at first. It took me like good 5 or 6 years to actually like development because in my family, I come from a family of developers, and then is kind of the job that I got. And how when did you manage to understand that you're actually liking it and that you're good at it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that I really started to realize that I was like decent at it, and more specifically that I liked it during the game development days. I think that like one interesting thing about back-end development is a lot of the times it's not very flashy, but especially while I was working on like modifications for games, etc., you really got to see your work like manifest itself. And so it was really interesting for me to just kind of like have that finishing product, etc. And that was kind of like really what got me captivated. And I've always been really interested in like puzzle solving, etc. So I think that like pretty much from the get-go, I knew it was something that I really enjoyed. As a matter of kind of like finding out that I was good at it, I still don't know if I have.
You are
Um,
really good at it.
yeah, but I mean, it's something that I just really enjoy, and I think that that's kind of like the core reason of what stuck me around with it, and kind of deciding to go with it for a career. Um, yeah, mostly it was just something that I found that I didn't want to put down, and genuinely enjoy the work, which not everybody gets to. So I think that that's a real blessing to be able to find something that you enjoy.
Amazing, bro. Amazing. I want to ask you something, and it's a little bit of a hard question. People may even leave this chat after this question. Is crypto real? Is this risk we're taking right now to learn solidity, become good auditors, won't be replaced tomorrow by some good and completely different technology?
Yeah, I think that it's a good question. It's actually not I think as controversial as you presented. I think that a lot of people think about that whenever they're starting in new industries. Things like crypto, things like AI, a lot of these new things that people are looking at and saying, hey, I really want to work there. The one thing that I would focus on, especially if you're kind of in a Web 2 job and thinking about, hey, is smart contract security or blockchain security a good thing for me, is really kind of what you'll learn along the way. Even if it doesn't work out, even if crypto blows up and it doesn't become something that means something to the world and really changes things, the skills that you gain along the way will lend you to work in entirely different career fields, kind of onboard yourself into new and exotic systems pretty quickly. So I don't think that that's really like a concern that people should be having whenever they're looking at kind of jumping into the crypto space.
Amazing.
To answer the question more directly, I don't think that crypto is kind of a nothing thing. I think that it really does have the capacity to change a lot of things in society. And assuming that like if we execute correctly and bring this big like social consensus layer together, we do have a really big fighting chance to kind of change how financial systems work, social coordination, etc. Will that happen? We've yet to see. Are there a lot of people that are working very hard on making that happen? Absolutely.
I completely agree with you, and it's really confusing because, in crypto, you got to be really careful. How many times we saw these projects like Luna, like imagine FTX, bro. FTX happening is crazy. It's just like Binance happening, So I get really, really divided, because as much as I love this industry, it's so risky, and auditing is even riskier because tomorrow some AI can come and just replace us. Can you talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, and I think that like as a smart contract developer, like I'm not an auditor. I mainly work on protocol development, etc. And obviously there comes to be kind of some security things involved in there. But my day job isn't auditing. One thing that I do know as a protocol developer is that you kind of feel like you're walking on eggshells a lot of the time. And I think that part of that comes from the fact that we're in a really nascent VM. The tooling around it has evolved exponentially over the couple of years. So I started writing smart contracts with Ganache and Truffle. And if you look at Foundry, it's just worlds apart. Um, One of the big things is I think that we still don't have sufficient tooling for people to really be confident in what they're making. And then the other thing too is that while you're writing smart contracts, you're thinking a lot differently than you are when you're writing other types of code. Obviously, a lot of the times people aren't writing upgradable contracts, etc. You're potentially writing code that's supposed to live on the chain pretty much until Ethereum dies. And so it's one of the things that I think that we need more education around. Our tooling needs to advance, and then on top of that, I think that the biggest thing is like more research needs to be done in how to create more easily formally verifiable EVMs, etc. And there's a lot of work going on there. I have zero doubt that in the next couple of years it'll be a lot easier to write secure contracts, and that smart contract developers will be able to get better sleep at night because of that. Um, but yeah, I think that the sentiment there, especially with all of the vulnerabilities that we've seen over the past year, etc., it's definitely a concern. Now, one thing that I will point out is that if you look at teams which follow very good engineering practices, they rely mostly on their test suite and the game theory of their architecture design, etc. A lot of the times, those teams get off pretty well. So, like a good example of that is like Yearn. So, a lot of the Yearn strategies actually went without audits. One of the reasons why they were able to do that so successfully is because they had a pretty rigorous strategy for how they would merge and integrate new strategies into their protocol. So I think that like the other thing too is a lot of people look at audits as a stamp of approval in a sense, and I think that we all know, especially anybody here that works in security, we all know that they're not kind of like an end all be all thing. You obviously could have missed something, depending on how much time the person that hired you to audit paid for. Like if you only looked at a code base for 20 hours, you might have missed something that you would have seen if you looked at it for 60, 80 hours, etc. So I think that like what it really comes into is like the smart contract development community is young, like myself. A lot of them don't have wonderful engineering practices enshrined in their day-to-day routine, and I think that that comes with kind of just the demographic that gets attracted into smart contract development. But one thing that I think can really improve is if we get more people kind of educating on good engineering practices, good testing strategies, setting new standards to make sure that people are writing more secure code. Um, and once again, I think that the community has done an incredible job on that. So you see places like OpenSense having these amazing places for people to gather and get educated. You have Patrick Alpha C, who does amazing courses on YouTube, and then so on and so forth. The community has been getting better on that. If you look back 2 years ago, it was hard to find any smart contract engineering knowledge that wasn't really esoteric. So I think that if we look 5 years ahead of now, this problem will probably be, much easier to look at than it is right now.
Makes total sense, bro. And I want to ask you kind of a hard question right now because it comes with development, and I've been in Web3 development for a while now, and I can tell you that there's not a lot of code to be done with Solidity. Mostly it's not a full API, it's not a whole application. Usually, what you have is a smart contract, maybe let's say 10. It is already a very complex application. I mean, it seems to me like we need way less developers with Web3, and specifically with Ethereum and Solidity, than we would usually need with any sort of Web2 applications. Are we gonna have enough demand in the future, like to keep on Web3 development, or because we're having all these layoffs now with Google and everything, and AI, ChatGPT, we're gonna have only the best working.
Yeah, I think a lot of things go into that question, which is kind of like you have to consider, will blockchains be adopted? Will blockchains scale? Will we have AI just writing every single one of our contracts? And then you also can think of like how necessary will it be for the vast majority of people to have like custom tailor-made contracts whenever there are templates for simple things like creating an escrow contract or creating a new ERC20, etc. I think that there will always be a demand. Um, Although I do think, like any other job market, things will start to specialize a lot more. You won't really have people that get hired to be a smart contract developer, you'll have somebody get hired for a more niche purpose. It's kind of like there very rarely is somebody's job title a Java developer or a Golang developer, right? In general, a lot of the time, those people are hired for more niche purposes where the languages may be used to fit some sort of application, but their job title isn't a matter of like the entire field that they're working in. And so I think that as things start to specialize, obviously there are certain things that will pay more, there are certain things that will pay less. Um, but I do see there being a future in which there's a very large job market around development in the blockchain space.
Yeah, I do believe in that, bro. I'm all in. I'm super excited about the changes that are happening right now in the space. I'm quite excited about the BRC20 standard. I don't know how much you know about that, but to me, something along the lines of Ethereum happening on Bitcoin would be something magical. What is your view on the whole Bitcoin ecosystem and how much are you, into it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not super invested into the technical side of Bitcoin. It was the first blockchain that I was introduced to back in like 2014. I was kind of playing around with it on my laptop, etc. Um, I do think that it was a necessary protocol to pave the way for kind of future blockchains that can take on more features, etc. Personally, I do think that it does have a future. I'm concerned about its incentive mechanism basically failing at some point. Um, I also think that in general, I'm more bullish on blockchains that have virtual machines attached. But the other thing about that is stepping away from the whole blockchain argument. At a point, we probably won't even need blockchains anymore. If you think about what blockchains are, as effectively they're a very large state machine
Yeah.
that allows us to kind of pull in all of these inputs for the state transition function. And if you can actually prove those state transition functions on your own computer and then just have other people verify the proofs, in essence, there's no real need for this very large, clunky distributed network. And so I think that like in an ideal world in the future, blockchains will become somewhat obsolete in favor of provable generalized execution. But also, I think that that's a very far out thing, and we probably won't see that in the next couple of years. One thing that I am sure of, if that does happen, is that blockchains will inevitably be a core part of that development. It's a necessary stepping stone to get to a point where we don't need something like a blockchain to have provable execution shared among a distributed network.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense, bro. And I want to ask you now, talking about solidity development and talking about going over solidity, what are some tricky things about coding solidity? What are the edge cases, like when testing data, when dealing with call stack? What are things that are easy to miss?
Yeah, I think that like a lot of the things that come with Solidity are interesting in that they're unique from other languages like Viper, etc. Solidity is this weird language that I love, but I also recognize how bad it is. Um, so if you look at something, yeah, I mean, it's a controversial thing, but I think everybody can kind of look at it and be like, Solidity is this weird amalgamation of JavaScript and C put together. It gives you this weird access to kind of like lower level inline assembly, etc., while also trying to be a high level, strongly typed language at the same time. And a lot of that can lead to pretty unsafe behavior. So one thing that you'll notice obviously is people try to gas optimize, etc. I'm a huge fan of gas optimizations. I think it's very fun. I love digging around low level EVM stuff. But the other thing that I do realize as well is that it can get to a point where you're creating a more difficult to maintain protocol, etc. And I think that like Solidity is just this really weird language in that there are foot guns kind of everywhere. And a lot of those foot guns, you kind of have to be in the know in order to actually pick up on them. So the Solidity compiler is great in that it produces correct code every single time, meaning that the compilation output is deterministic. It's everything that you expect from a compiler. There's no like super weird gotchas when it comes to code gen. But then in terms of actually looking at the syntax, you don't get these compile time assertions that you would expect from a compiler that's deploying code that's supposed to live on a blockchain forever. So when it comes to things like reentrancy bugs, etc., you have to resort to using a static analysis tool like Slither. When it comes to like weird return data bomb attacks, a lot of the times it's hard to pick things like that up. We actually had like a pretty interesting vulnerability that pulled up at Optimism recently, where somebody took advantage of a reentrancy guard, which is something that like I personally had never seen before. And so yeah, and so it's these weird things that kind of like pop up every now and again that uh, new attack patterns and new vulnerabilities are always going to be present, especially as new patterns emerge. So we're getting a bunch of really really interesting additions to the EVM that will kind of make new patterns that people have been dreaming of for a long time possible. And with that, security experts are also going to need to up their game. We're getting transient storage, we're getting new jump opcodes, we're getting all of EOF, and these things that will make Solidity development and just smart contract development in general, regardless of what language you're using, a lot kind of more verbose. Um, and I would say that like the biggest thing is to just read up, make sure you consult all of these people that make all of the knowledge about the exploits that they found public. I think that that's probably the best way to stay on top of like new vulnerabilities that are being found, and also to make sure that in your audits, if you're a security expert listening, that you're able to kind of spot patterns that people have already come across, etc. Um, and yeah, I think that like there are gotchas everywhere, so it'd be naive to just look at one. But in general, there like my main complaint is that there are so many, and it's also very difficult to stay on top of them due to the lack of tooling that we have around smart contract development, or I guess the lack of its maturity.
Yeah, yeah. I want to talk a little bit about Huff because I know you love it. And I do like Huff, but I feel the developer shouldn't be doing the compiler job. Like maybe Solidity compiler is not at that level yet, and it's okay. But is is it? Should we really be writing bytecode? Like, can we talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, yeah. So just as kind of like a pre-note, right? I love Huff. I think Huff is amazing. I also don't think that you should ever deploy a Huff contract in production if you don't know 100% what you're doing. Um, the thing about Huff, which is different from a language that's compiled and generates code in the background for you, is that you're as close to the metal as possible. Huff has very, very, very few things where it'll actually insert extra bytecode for you. I think the only thing that can do that is like the function, which none of you might even know about, which is you can define an FN rather than a macro. Um, and so Huff is an amazing way to learn about the low level EVM. I think that's what I try to shill Huff for, is that it's an amazing educational tool. So if you're kind of like newer to smart contract engineering and you mainly have written higher level languages like Solidity and Viper, Huff is a great way to understand what those compilers are actually generating for you. And so when it comes to writing a lot of Huff, what you'll notice is that you kind of get more intuition as to what these compilers do for you. You can make your own optimizations, etc., if you know that the compiler is going to do something suboptimal. But I think like I would agree with your statement, which is like, should we really be writing Huff in production? Probably not. There's some very, very, very niche use cases where you could see it being advantageous. Um, yeah, exactly. Like something like an MEV contract, something like a really complex math function. Like if you wanted to implement the Poseidon hash function in EVM, you'd probably have to do it in Huff to make sure that the transaction would even fit inside of a block. Um, and so things like that. But I think that, like I said, primarily Huff is an educational tool.
Amazing, bro. And you just told something really interesting, which is math. So one thing solidity auditors are really scared of is any form of algorithm, any form of mathematical equation. How often you need to work with that? How often you need to be coming up with some, calculation or something.
I would say that in practice, well, first of all, I think it kind of depends on what you're working on. I would say that in my day-to-day job, not too often. Normally, it's simple math, nothing too complex. Um, but then from time to time, you do need to write some pretty interesting algorithms, right? So you can see that other people have already done a lot of the legwork. Anything that you kind of commonly need to use, such as like full mode div with like 512-bit precision, etc. That's in Solady, which I know that you guys are auditing. Um, and so, like most of the legwork has already been done for you and audited and made sure that it's secure. Um, but at the end of the day, I don't see people really interacting with like more complicated math on like a daily basis. But then again, it also entirely depends on what you're working on. So I wrote a Groth 16 snark verifier, and I've gone through a significant amount of math courses, and so I was able to pick up on it after learning about snarks and reading through the paper and kind of doing the math on pen and paper. But I don't think that most people will kind of have to audit these like crazy complex math functions that are over their head. That's just not something that you see in the wild too often.
Yeah, I mean that's really good because I'm really scared of it. I can calculate some yield curves and some yield bonds, but I don't know. It feels like every day, we have these new things coming up with smart contracts, and it's just hard to keep up, and especially hard to audit. Thankfully, today we have things like fuzzling and everything. Can you talk a little bit about your environment? What do you use usually, like Meteos, Liter, VS Code, Visual Studio?
Yeah, sure. So most of the time, or actually pretty much all of the time, I just write code in NeoVim. I personally am not a huge fan of like heavyweight IDEs or anything like that. I just like to keep things in my terminal. Um, and then in terms of tooling, I kind of just keep it to the basics. I try not to like use too much tooling other than what's necessary. So I've kind of like obviously Foundry on my computer, Slither, um, Pyrometer, which is a new tool that Nascent just released, and then a couple of other things like Echidna whenever I need it, etc. Um, but yeah, primarily I just write code in NeoVim and then use the tools that I find useful. Um, but I try not to uh, pollute the environment too much in terms of trying to use 40 tools at once. I just also posted a link to my dot files if anybody is curious about all of the tools because I don't want to walk through the full list.
Amazing, bro. Can you tell me something, Bex? In your view, what makes a good developer? What makes someone that can really delivers scalable code?
uh, I think that obviously I think that I'm still growing as a developer myself, but from what I've observed from people that I consider great developers is that they are excellent problem solvers. And I know that that's a very general thing to say, um, but if you think about it, a lot of your job on a day-to-day basis is coming into problems that you've never interacted with before and that you've never solved, and then having to try to figure out exactly how you get around it, how you get around it and gain a good result. And so the people that really stand out, at least to me, are the people that are creative with that problem solving, efficient and effective. And it seems to be like one of those things. You don't need to have a PhD in math. You don't need to be the greatest person at writing code, etc. But generally, as long as you can kind of maneuver problems, come up with a good solution, and at the very least be resilient around that, I think that that's really what separates people that are good and people that are great.
Bro, we went into such a important point right now. Resilience is key. Resilience is key in development, and resilience is everything in auditing. I mean, when dealing with code, it's all about frustration, because you're gonna write it the first time and it's gonna be wrong. and you're gonna write the second time, and you guys are lucky because now you guys have ChatGPT that can give you the template. But Vex, remember back in the day, we needed to actually think on it, so it wasn't so easy, you know. Bro, I want to ask you something. We're almost at the end of it. I have a few questions from community, but I want to ask you something about layer twos, okay? So Ethereum is technically walking into being fast computing and cheap computing after the splurge and everything. I know you are in close ties with Optimism, which is a great network. Everybody loves it, but what if Ethereum got so cheap that layer twos become a little bit like an alternative and not such a go-to?
I don't think that will happen. So, Ethereum, just based off of its design, as it scales and sees more throughput, it's just going to become more and more expensive. Now, there are a couple of things that we can do to mitigate that. We can start pruning state. We can start implementing new EIPs that figure out ways to reduce the state bloat going forward. Um, but I think that a lot of those things are unrealistic. What Ethereum is probably going to be in the long term is a big giant data availability layer. And what that basically means is it means that other things like rollups, alternatives to rollups in the future, if rollups ever become archaic, what they'll do is they'll post state commitments down to Ethereum mainnet and use this base layer of a security to make sure that they can actually, commit to their state, even if it's only for a small time, like post 4844, etc. Um, but really, what Ethereum can do is it can give us this large base layer of security and decentralization so that other things like rollups or any future inventions that follow a different path have this very large decentralized secure data availability layer. And so I could be totally wrong, but after everything that I've learned, I don't think that Ethereum will head in a direction where it becomes cheap enough to the point where people will stop considering using things like L2s or even alternate